Olá, olá, olá a todos. Sejam muito bem-vindos, sejam todas muito bem-vindas. Muito prazer. Eu sou a Carla Fiorito, sou jornalista, mestre de cerimônias e para mim uma grande honra conduzir aqui essa grande noite de reconhecimento ao lado de cada um de vocês. Nós estamos transmitindo este evento ao vivo através do YouTube da Broadcast, também do portal Estadão. E vamos dar início agora ao evento que premiará os prestigiados ranking Broadcast Analistas, Projeções e Empresas. Olha, já são 27 anos de tradição do Prêmio Broadcast Analistas, 25 anos do Prêmio Broadcast Empresas e 19 anos do Prêmio Broadcast Projeções, que contam com a credibilidade editorial da Broadcast Agência Estado, uma empresa que, como vocês sabem, é líder em notícias e que, claro, oferece diversas soluções baseadas em conteúdos, em dados e também em tecnologia. Hoje nós vamos celebrar aqui juntos todos os profissionais que estarão destacados nesses prêmios. E em nome de toda a equipe Broadcast, quero fazer o nosso agradecimento especial às empresas presentes e que patrocinam o nosso evento. São elas: Boyden, Equinix, Fênix Market Data, Hiperflow, Nasdaq, Opus, Pinheiro Neto Advogados, Rimini Street e Uquibar. Também o nosso agradecimento à Fundação Getúlio Vargas pela parceria na validação do ranking Empresas e ao apoio do CNN Money e Estadão. Bem, além do anúncio dos grandes vencedores em cada uma das premiações, o nosso conteúdo de hoje também traz uma palestra exclusiva do economista Nouriel Roubini. Mas antes, eu gostaria de chamar aqui ao nosso palco o CEO da Broadcast, o Denis Piovesan, para dar as boas-vindas a todos nós. Vem para cá, Denis. Boa noite.
Boa noite, pessoal. Obrigado a todos vocês pela presença. E começo agradecendo os nossos premiados que estão aqui, por estarem participando do nosso prêmio, agradecendo nossos patrocinadores, agradecendo o nosso palestrante e, acima de tudo, nossos convidados. Hoje temos 280 pessoas aqui com a gente, é o recorde do nosso prêmio aqui, nunca foi maior do que isso, então obrigado a todos. Também é importante dizer que esse prêmio ele se consolida a cada ano, né? A gente já está rodando o prêmio há 27 anos, então é a 27ª edição, acho que é uma referência de mercado e a gente vem com o intuito sempre de melhorar, tornar ele mais importante, mais relevante e a barra vai subindo, o que mostra a capacidade e competência de quem participa dessa premiação. E por fim, eu estou aqui há pouco mais de um ano, aqui na Broadcast, agradecer o time que vem apoiando, agradecer a Juliana, a Tainara de marketing, o Jean, que ajudaram o nosso evento aqui. Não seria possível sem elas. E convido a todos para assistir um pequeno vídeo aqui sobre a Broadcast, o que a gente tem feito de diferente. Acho que é importante dar uma atualização para todos, sendo que muitos são nossos usuários heavy users, então é importante todos estarem dando uma olhada nisso. Obrigado e bom evento a todos.
O mercado não desacelera e a Broadcast, Agência Estado, acompanha esse ritmo há mais de 50 anos, sendo sinônimo de agilidade, confiança e inovação. Pioneira em distribuir informações em tempo real no Brasil, a Broadcast construiu uma trajetória poderosa e que agora caminha lado a lado com conteúdo, dados e tecnologia. Com parceiros globais, possui uma linha completa de soluções tecnológicas para a tomada de decisão. Entre as últimas inovações está o Broadcast OTC, uma solução para negociação de ativos e gestão de back-office. E também o Broadcast Radar, que usa a inteligência artificial para fazer um monitoramento de temas relevantes, com análise de sentimentos e foco em acompanhamento de mídias. Falando em inovação, o Broadcast, que já é líder no mercado financeiro no Brasil, está ainda mais completo com uma nova plataforma, unindo um layout mais moderno, funcionalidades pensadas para facilitar a rotina de quem acompanha e opera o mercado. Além disso, possui novos módulos de parceiros estratégicos, que agregam mais valor à tomada de decisão. E não para por aí. Agora você vai poder contar com dados preditivos para o terminal, baseados em mais de 30 milhões de notícias e receber conteúdos através do seu WhatsApp. A Broadcast não para e está trabalhando cada dia mais para usar tecnologia ao seu favor. Broadcast. Informação que move o mercado.
Muito bem, Denis, muito obrigada por estar aqui com a gente também, pelo que você trouxe, as suas palavras. E nós vamos começar agora com o Prêmio Broadcast Projeções, que há 19 anos reconhece os economistas do mercado financeiro e as instituições que mais acertaram em suas projeções econômicas. O levantamento é feito pela Broadcast e revela as casas que conseguem ficar mais próximas dos principais indicadores econômicos do país. Os participantes são bancos, corretoras, gestoras de investimentos, consultorias e também outras instituições que enviam para a Broadcast as suas projeções econômicas em duas diferentes categorias, top básico e top geral. De acordo com a metodologia própria da Broadcast, são premiados os 10 primeiros colocados em cada um desses dois grupos. Então, chegou a hora de saber quem são os vencedores do Prêmio Broadcast Projeções 2025, referente aos indicadores econômicos do ano passado, o ano de 2024. A gente começa com a categoria Top Básico, que considera as projeções para juros, câmbio e inflação. Pessoal, um aviso importante aqui, por conta do nosso tempo, né, de evento, infelizmente, não vamos poder receber todos os 10 vencedores de cada uma das categorias aqui no nosso palco. Então, eu vou anunciar todos os premiados, mas somente os 3 primeiros colocados desta premiação deverão subir aqui ao palco para receber os troféus. Os demais premiados, do 10º ao 4º lugar, claro, vão receber os seus troféus no final da nossa cerimônia, no momento do coquetel. Então, vamos lá. O 10º lugar do Prêmio Broadcast Projeções, na categoria Top Básico, vai para MB Associados. Já na 9ª posição do Prêmio Broadcast Projeções 2025, temos Caixa Asset. Na 8ª colocação do Prêmio Broadcast Projeções, categoria Top Básico, eu anuncio a Câmara dos Dirigentes Lojistas de Porto Alegre. Já o 7º colocado do ranking é a Fundação de Previdência Complementar do Servidor Público Federal do Poder Executivo, FUNPRESP. Na 6ª colocação do ranking, na categoria Top Básico, temos Go Associados. 5ª posição do Prêmio Broadcast Projeções, categoria Top Básico, temos MCM for Intelligence. 4ª posição do ranking, Pesco Economics. Muito bem, e agora, então, para a entrega do troféu ao 3º colocado do Prêmio Broadcast Projeções na categoria Top Básico, eu convido aqui ao nosso palco o sócio da Boyden, uma das empresas patrocinadoras do nosso evento. Vem para cá, por favor, Davi Sion Turquier. Bem-vindo. Tudo bom? Por favor. Troféu em mãos, e eu anuncio, então, o 3º lugar do Prêmio Broadcast Projeções na categoria Top Básico, que vai para Caixa Econômica Federal. Convido a gerente executiva da Caixa Econômica Federal, Zélia Rodrigues de Paula, venha para cá receber o troféu e fazer o seu agradecimento. Bem-vinda e parabéns. Se vocês quiserem ficar mais no centro do palco para a gente fazer a foto com o logo. Parabéns, Zélia. Pode ficar à vontade, o microfone é aberto para você.
Bom, o que dizer, né? Se não, obrigada. Obrigada aos colegas da equipe de cenários que estão aqui comigo, aos que ficaram também em Brasília, que fazem parte de um time de extrema qualidade, do qual eu tenho a grata satisfação de fazer parte. Agradecer à Caixa Econômica pela oportunidade de exercer a minha profissão, que eu tanto amo, aos meus gestores por me possibilitarem as melhores condições de trabalho, o apoio incondicional, e ao Broadcast por promover esse prêmio, que tanto valoriza a nossa categoria, né, de economistas e o nosso trabalho. Obrigada e boa noite.
Alô, alô? Agora sim. Só porque eu pedi o microfone. Obrigada, Zélia. Parabéns à Caixa Econômica Federal pelo prêmio. E obrigada, claro, Davi, pela sua participação. E agora, para a entrega do troféu ao segundo colocado do Prêmio Broadcast Projeções na categoria Top Básico, eu convido ao nosso palco Rodrigo Guerreiro, diretor comercial sênior da Equinix, também patrocinadora do nosso evento. Seja muito bem-vindo, por favor. Muito bem, vamos lá então. Segundo lugar do ranking na categoria Top Básico vai para Agora Investimentos. Eu convido o economista-chefe da Agora Investimentos, Dalton Gardman. Vem para cá receber o troféu no palco e fazer o seu breve agradecimento. Bem-vindo, parabéns.
Super breve aqui, né? Bom, mesmo um pouco de humor aqui, era aqueles agradecimentos do Maguila, né? Com aquela longa lista, os mais velhinhos vão lembrar dos agradecimentos do Maguila. Queria agradecer primeiro ao Broadcast, a direção da Agro, ela que sempre dá autonomia para a gente, a economista Maria Clara aqui, que toca todas essas projeções, né? Me impede de eu colocar a Selic a 17 ou a 8, né? Por isso que a gente está aqui dentro do palco. Ricardo França, que trouxe toda a equipe dele aqui, que eu não vou citar todos aqui para cumprir minha promessa de ser breve. Obrigado a todos, pessoal.
Muito obrigada, Dalton. Parabéns. Parabéns pelo prêmio, parabéns à Agora Investimentos. Obrigada também pela presença, Rodrigo. E a gente avança agora para a entrega do troféu ao primeiro colocado na categoria Top Básico do Prêmio Broadcast Projeções. Convidando, então, a editora executiva da Broadcast. Vem para cá, Cristina Canas. Bem-vinda! Vamos nessa, então. Cris. O primeiro lugar do Prêmio Broadcast Projeções na categoria Top Básico vai para C6 Bank. Com muita honra eu convido Felipe Salles, economista-chefe do C6 Bank, vem para cá receber, também agradecer o troféu pela instituição. Bem-vindo. Felipe, o microfone aberto para você.
Bom, muito boa noite a todos. Eu acho que todos os que estão aqui presentes nesse evento sabem do esforço, da dificuldade, da responsabilidade que é fazer projeções, cada um em sua área, tá? E sabem também da grande satisfação que é quando a gente consegue ter esse reconhecimento aqui de um evento dessa magnitude. Tá? Então, eu queria agradecer muito ao Broadcast, queria agradecer ao C6 Bank por dar condições de excelente trabalho. E, bom, todo mundo sabe aqui também que isso não é o trabalho de uma pessoa só, é o trabalho de uma equipe. Então, eu queria um agradecimento especial para a minha equipe, me ajuda muito, o Eliezer está aqui presente, comigo. A Cláudia Moreno, Cláudia Rodrigues e Felipe Mack não puderam vir, mas fica um abraço para eles também, um grande agradecimento. Muito obrigado.
Obrigada a você, parabéns pelo prêmio, mais uma vez, prêmio da C6 Bank, parabéns também a todas as instituições premiadas na categoria Top Básico. Obrigada também, Cristina Canas, pela entrega aqui do troféu. E a gente segue, nesse momento, com mais uma premiação do ranking Projeções, agora a categoria Top Geral, que considera as projeções de 7 indicadores. Então, vamos aos vencedores também na mesma dinâmica. O 10º lugar do Prêmio Broadcast Projeções na categoria Top Geral vai para Suno Research. Na 9ª posição do Prêmio Broadcast Projeções 2024, eu anuncio MB Associados. No 8º lugar do Prêmio Broadcast Projeções, temos Kinitro Capital. 7ª colocação do ranking, temos MCM for Intelligence. Já na 6ª colocação do ranking, na categoria Top Geral, temos Banco JP Morgan. Já na 5ª posição do Prêmio Broadcast Projeções, na categoria Top Geral, temos Pesco Economics. E na 4ª posição do ranking, também na categoria Top Geral, eu anuncio Caixa Econômica Federal. Bom, agora para a entrega do troféu da 3ª colocação do Prêmio Broadcast Projeções na categoria Top Geral, quero convidar ao palco mais um representante dos nossos patrocinadores. Então, venha para cá, por favor. CEO da Hiperflow, Marcos Charcon, bem-vindo. Muito bom. Vamos lá, então. Apostos para anunciar a 3ª posição do Prêmio Broadcast Projeções na categoria Top Geral. E o vencedor é Go Associados. Convido ao palco o sócio executivo da Go Associados, Gessner Oliveira. Vem para cá. Seja muito bem-vindo. Parabéns ao prêmio. Gessner, à vontade para fazer seu agradecimento.
Olha, queria dedicar esse prêmio à equipe, naturalmente, que trabalha cotidianamente. Está aqui comigo o Lucas Saqueto, o Rafael Prado, a Amanda Alves e mais um conjunto de profissionais de várias profissões. Acho que é importante para projeções ter um aspecto multidisciplinar. E é muito importante combinar a análise financeira e a economia real. Essa é a filosofia com a qual trabalhamos e a equipe está de parabéns por esse prêmio. Obrigado.
Muito bom. Obrigada, Gessner. Parabéns. Obrigada, Marcos, também pela presença. E agora, para a entrega do troféu ao 2º colocado, convido aqui ao palco o Luiz Gustavo Penteado, Associate Vice President Sales Latin America da Nasdaq. Bem-vindo. Vamos lá. O 2º lugar do ranking na categoria Top Geral vai para Ágora Investimentos. Convido mais uma vez o economista-chefe da Ágora, o Dalton Gardman. Vem para cá mais uma vez.
Pode pular o discurso para o próximo?
Não precisa pular, pode aproveitar.
Duplo agradecimento. Obrigado,
é isso
pessoal.
aí. Muito obrigada. Parabéns mais uma vez. Obrigada, Dalton. Agradeço também a participação do Luiz Gustavo. E agora eu quero convidar para a entrega do troféu ao 1º colocado dessa categoria, o diretor de novos negócios da Broadcast. Seja muito bem-vindo, Gustavo Ioriati. bem, Gustavo? Vamos lá, então, ao anúncio do primeiro lugar do Prêmio Broadcast Projeções na categoria Top Geral, que vai novamente para o C6 Bank. Felipe Salles, economista-chefe do C6 Bank, volta para cá, por favor. Parabéns mais uma vez. Se quiser agradecer, fica à vontade.
Bom, satisfação em dobro aqui essa noite, né? Eu quero agradecer a todos aqui presentes, muito obrigado. Enfim.
Parabéns pelo trabalho, parabéns pela
obrigado.
Conquista, parabéns para todo o time da C6 Bank pelo prêmio. Obrigada.
Muito obrigado.
Obrigada também, Gustavo, por mais essa entrega. E agora, gente, eu reforço que os troféus da 4ª colocação em diante dos vencedores das 2 categorias do ranking Projeções vão estar disponíveis com a nossa equipe, né? E no momento do nosso coquetel, a gente espera vocês ali, ó, no nosso backdrop, que está posicionado perto à mesa onde ficam os troféus, para vocês fazerem as fotos e os registros desse momento especial. Bom, e aqui, nesse momento, a partir de agora, eu quero informar que as instituições financeiras interessadas em participar do ranking Projeções poderão acessar o site broadcast.com.br para mais informações ou também procurar a equipe da Broadcast para fazer a inscrição. E a partir de 2026 temos uma novidade, serão premiadas somente as instituições classificadas na categoria Top Geral, que avalia as previsões para 7 indicadores da economia. São elas: IPCA, IGPM, Selic, relação dívida líquida PIB, câmbio, saldo da balança comercial e PIB. Bom, parabéns mais uma vez a todas as instituições premiadas no ranking Broadcast Projeções, nas categorias Top Básico e Top Geral. E agora, pessoal, a gente vai dar início a um conteúdo muito especial. Os convidados que desejarem, que precisarem, podem utilizar os fones para tradução simultânea, que será feita do inglês para o português. Eles foram entregues pelas recepcionistas no início do nosso evento. Quem ainda não pegou, pode sinalizar, então, para a gente poder levar até vocês. E para anunciar a recepção do nosso palestrante, eu vou convidar mais uma vez o CEO da Broadcast. Vem para cá, Denis Piobezan, contar para a gente sobre esse nosso momento especial. Bem-vindo mais uma vez.
Tudo bem? Boa noite novamente. Então, queria falar do nosso palestrante, professor Nouriel Roubini, da Universidade de Nova York. Previu a crise de 2008 e hoje eu estava num evento com ele mais cedo e todo mundo estava imaginando que ele também ia vir muito negativo sobre o mundo, com as visões de mundo, esperando a próxima crise. E, para surpresa de todos que estavam ali com a gente, ele trouxe um mundo mais colorido, mais bullish, um mundo diferente do que a gente imaginava na sua leitura. Mas, de qualquer forma, é bastante interessante escutar o que ele tem para dizer sobre geopolítica, sobre as tarifas, sobre a economia dos Estados Unidos como um todo, sobre tecnologia também, vai tocar bastante sobre tecnologia. Então, eu queria uma salva de palmas para receber o professor Roubini. Welcome, Professor Roubini. Your time now.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. Thank you for the very kind introduction. It's always a real great pleasure and honor coming back to Brazil. I used to come every year before COVID. Of course, during COVID, we were not able, but I've been here since at least 3 different times. And it's a special pleasure to come into Sao Paulo. I live in New York City, and Sao Paulo reminds me of New York City, city of business, of finance, of corporate activity, but also art, culture, music, food and entertainment. Also sophisticated and cosmopolitan, with many people coming from many and different types of ethnicity. Tonight I was asked to give you a big picture about the new global order or disorder of geopolitics, trade economics, and technology. And the first observation I'll make is the following one. We live in times of what I call unusual, unprecedented, unexpected uncertainty. So 4 U's, times of hyper uncertainty. And of course, the election of Donald Trump again to US presidency has created even more sources of uncertainty, volatility, and instability. And of course, I'm going to be talking about them. But I described this world of new hyper uncertainty already in my 2022 book titled Mega Threats. And in that book, I talked about not only about economic, monetary, and financial threats and opportunities, but also other ones, social, political, geopolitical, environmental, demographic, technological, and other ones. And to understand this complex world, you have to see both the economic and non-economic factors. I think that it's clear that we are facing a coming change in the global order, in the economic, monetary, and financial order, in the trade and investment order, in the technological order, and the political and geopolitical order as well. In my book, Megathreats, I discussed how there are 10 dangerous trends that imperil our future that are stagflationary, economic and non-economic factors. Stagflationary means they're going to increase inflation and reduce economic growth. But in the book, I also spoke about a brighter future. One that is more utopian rather than dystopian, and one is driven by technological innovations that over time can instead increase growth and reduce inflation. So there are positive supply shocks as opposed to being negative supply shock. And I want to try to understand and speak today about this interplay between the downsides and the upside risk. It's not black and white. As we'll see, the world is a mixed picture. On the geopolitical side, I would say that the main things are happening, many of them quite negative, are the following one. We're moving away from a world where the basics of international relation was multilateralism and some degree of cooperation to one of unilateralism. And it's not just the US is becoming unilateral by pursuing its national interests. Russia does it, China does it, India does it, Brazil does it, and even Europe that is not fully united. We're also moving away from a world that used to be, after the end of the Cold War, unipolar. There was one major power for a while, the United States, to a world that is either bipolar, with the US and China being the two global superpower, or sometimes people say is a multipolar world where there are other rising powers, global or regional, India, Europe, Russia, and several members of the global south, Brazil being a major regional power. Some people say it's neither unipolar or bipolar or multipolar, it's no polar. It's like the kind of a world of ground zero. It's also a world in which, unfortunately, we're moving away from global rules that the WTO, UN, and others were setting up to a world where there are going to be increasingly global deals among countries. From the world, in a world that with right, from one that is with right to one who has might. Might makes you right. Unfortunately, hard power makes you right in this world. From a world where there was global collective security to one in which maybe the world is going to be divided in spheres of influence between major powers. World in which between US and China there used to be cooperation and competition to one in which there is now a risk of confrontation and containment that could lead to full-scale not just trade war, but also economic wars and cold wars that become colder. We used to have benevolent alliances with
people that we consider as being friends, not just allies. Now we're moving to a world where major power think of them as being empire, and the smaller powers are just vassals. We move from a world of territorial restraint, everybody respecting the borders, to one of territorial grab. Trump says he wants Canada, he wants Greenland, he wants Panama. But Xi Jinping wants Taiwan and parts of Southeast Asia. And Putin doesn't want just Ukraine, he also wants to have control of the former Soviet Union and the near abroad. We used to have provision of global public goods, now instead is a resource grab. People want to grab as many resources as they can. We move from being internationalist to realism or real politics. And unfortunately, liberal democracy and democratic capitalism seems to be in a crisis because of both income and wealth inequality and economic insecurity, and various forms of relative populism and relative autocracy or illiberal democracy arising. And of course, as I pointed out, income and wealth inequality and economic insecurity are behind this change towards economic and political populism. These kind of geopolitical shifts are also leading to changes in the economic order and the economic system. We're moving away from strictly private sector-led growth to government intervention in key sectors of the economy. We're going away from the neoliberalism of the Washington Consensus that said macro stability, privatize and liberalize trade, to economic populism, from market-oriented regimes to variants of state capitalism, not just in China, but also elsewhere. We had a couple of decades of hyper-globalization with more trade in goods, in services, in the movement of capital, labor, data, information technology. Now we're moving towards variants of deglobalization, globalization, slowbalization, decoupling, de-risking, and you name it. We've gone away from trade and financial integration to more economic and financial fragmentation. Labor migration used to be okay, acceptable, from south to north, from poor to rich, but now in the US, in Europe, in other parts of the world, there's a crackdown against illegal migration. Even if many countries like the US, migrants actually increase economic growth and benefit economic activity. We're moving away from the pursuit of economic efficiency to pursuit of economic security and resilience because of military and national security kind of concerns. We used to have just-in-time global supply chains, many of them based on China, to just-in-case, China plus one, or China plus. But even China plus in this world of tariff is not sufficient. We used to appreciate the benefits of foreign direct investment, inward and outward, and of offshoring, but now everybody's talking about reshoring, friendshoring, or nearshoring. We used to have models of economic growth based on low taxes and supply-side economics to now models of economic growth where you talk about having high transfers to individuals or preferred firms, subsidies and tax credits to key and favorite economic sectors and firms. We've gone away from free competition to the support of national champion, big firms that are considered important for a country, like in US, big tech, or the same thing in China. We've gone away from laissez-faire free markets to the pursuit of industrial policies, from hands-off government to hands-on government. And we used to have democracy and competition policy, but increasingly there are phenomena of plutocracy, kleptocracy, and various forms of economic and financial oligarchy. We're maybe moving away from a world in which there was a dollar supremacy and dominance, what people refer to as the exorbitant privilege of the United States, to one in which there is a risk of de-dollarization. So these are some of the economic trends. However, there is another important trend, in addition to geopolitics, trade, and economics, that has to do with technology. If you look at the history of the global economy since the global financial crisis, after the global financial crisis, the recovery of growth was anemic and inflation was low because there was deleveraging and demand was low. So you had low growth, below potential, and low inflation below target, at least in advanced economies. That's why we went to zero policy rates, negative policy rates, quantitative easing, credit easing. That period of time was defined as a secular stagnation, one in which growth was low, inflation was low because of painful deleveraging from a balance sheet recession. But then, from a secular stagnation, during COVID and after COVID, we moved to a period of time of secular stagflation. And stagflation is a period of time where, because of negative supply shock, growth is lower, but inflation is higher, as opposed to being lower when you have secular stagnation. Because secular stagnation comes when demand is weak, so low growth and low inflation, while if you have a negative supply shock, you have lower growth and higher inflation. That's exactly what happened after the negative supply shocks of COVID. And my book on mega threats was exactly about these potential stagflationary forces in the world economy, from deglobalization to geopolitical conflict to a variety of other ones. However, because of the new technologies of the future, driven by artificial intelligence, machine learning, and others, we may be, in the next few years, we're not yet, on the verge of a secular boom, one in which growth is going to be higher and inflation is going to be lower, not because demand is weak, but because there is an increase in the supply of goods and services. So secular stagnation to secular stagflation to now potentially a secular boom. For decades, artificial intelligence was what the people refer to in a winter, the winter of AI. Same thing for quantum. The idea of quantum computing was an idea without application. Same thing for energy revolution like fusion. So we've gone from a winter in AI, in fusion and quantum, to now an AI-leading boom, where now in quantum, in fusion, in AI, people believe they're going to radically increase productivity growth. And people are already talking about AGI, artificial general intelligence. We may be reaching it by the beginning of the next decade. People even talk about ASI, artificial superintelligent, where the machines are going to become much more intelligent than human. This change in the growth process driven by technology has also implication for inflation. During the secular stagnation, you had low inflation because you had weak demand and deleveraging. Then we went to a period of high inflation following the COVID shock because of variety of stagflationary shock, reducing growth and increasing prices. But if we're entering an era of a secular boom where the supply of goods and services will be increased because of technology, you'll have deflation, but good deflation. Bad deflation is when there is not enough demand, like the Great Depression. Good deflation is where you have prices cheaper because the supply of goods and services is increased by technology, and therefore it's less costly to produce all these goods and services. And if you think about the technologies and the industries of the future, everybody's excited these days about generative AI, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. You can identify at least 12 or 13 technologies and industries of the future that are going to change radically everything we do. Potential growth, productivity, and so on. The first one, of course, is AI, Gen AI, machine learning. They may lead us to AGI by the end of this decade. But then there is a revolution in semiconductors with much more advanced ones, with producers like, for example, NVIDIA, TSMC, and Samsung. You have a revolution of robotic and automation including the emergence in the next few years of humanoid robots who can do anything that the factory worker can do, that the construction worker can do, that the housekeeper can do. There is biomedical research and synthetic biologies is going to allow us to live longer and more healthy. There is quantum computing and the future merger of it with AI. There is, of course, space exploration and exploitation that could become a $1 trillion industry in the next decade. And unfortunately, in a world of a geopolitical recession or depression where there is conflict between great powers, everybody's spending more on defense, but not just traditional defense. The new weapon systems are going to be semi-autonomous, based on drones, and therefore the new defense is defense tech rather than traditional ones. As we have seen in the Russia-Ukraine war, you can destroy a $30 million tank with a $10,000 drone, or you can destroy $6-7 billion of bombers, the most advanced ones of Russia, again with a cheap drone. Therefore, defense is completely changing. There'll be also a revolution in ag tech, whether it's vertical farming or using robots in farming or other technologies. With cheap energy, cheap water, you can do ag tech. In energy, it's not just the green tech and the renewable revolution, but there's a new form of energy that may emerge in the next few years, fusion, that more than renewable could help us to resolve climate change. And of course, we have the developments and the novelties in green tech and the mobility revolution with now electric vehicles and eventually autonomous vehicles, and the new frontiers of geoengineering that are going to help us to address climate change. Of course, there is fintech, and many of you, being in the financial sector, know about it. New non-traditional forms of financial services that are going to revolutionize payment system, lending, insurance with insurtech, asset management, even capital market activities. Finally, there are a few other technologies of the future going to be important. First, new material science is leading to new materials and new types of manufacturing, including 3D printing and nanotechnologies, and cybersecurity and new forms of cryptography. Now, if you look at the world and you ask yourself, who is the leader in these technologies of the future, China is ahead in the mobility revolution so far, EV and green tech. But in most of these other technologies, actually, the US is number one. China is behind, trying to catch up, and everybody else is number 3, 4, 5, whatever. Of course, there are pockets of excellence in Europe, pockets of excellence in Israel, in India, in Japan with robotic and automation, in Taiwan and South Korea in semiconductors. But essentially, the dominant players in the technology of the future are US and China. It's not a big deal because many of them are what we call GPT, general purpose technology. So even if you don't innovate, but you adapt this new technology, you can grow faster, After all, electricity was invented in the US by Edison, but now even a small village in Brazil or in sub-Saharan Africa can benefit from electrification. Or no one in sub-Saharan Africa has ever produced a smartphone or a cell phone, but you can buy a cheap $100 smartphone, and even the poor farmer can buy and sell his crops, can insure them, can predict the weather, and do lots of financial activity using essentially virtual finance rather than having to go to a bricks and mortar bank. So even adaptation benefits people, even if you're not among the innovation. Now, the US being the number one implies that, in my view, US potential growth that has been estimated recently to be only 1.8%, by the end of this decade could be as high as 4%. And I would say that today, given the recent 2 years of growth closer to 3%, US growth potential is closer to 3% already. And productivity growth since 2019 has already doubled from 1% to 2% in spite of its dip during COVID. The other important aspect of this revolution is that traditionally When there are growth innovation, they are logarithmic. You have a spurt of increasing potential growth, and then it flattens out, goes down, like the first internet revolution. US growth went from 2 to 3%, and then went back to 2. Instead, the nature of this innovation is that they are exponential. US growth now is 2, it'll be 4 by the end of this decade, could be 6% by the end of the 2040 decade. It's quite remarkable if you're looking at how things are changing. Meaning this technology, first of all, are not just AI. I talked about a dozen of technologies of the future, but what's happening is more important than anything else in human history. Is more important than the invention of fire, of agriculture, of the printing press, of the steam engine, of the railroads, of electricity, of the first and second industrial revolution, and the first digital revolution. And if things are exponential, it's important because you have a first mover advantage. When growth is logarithmic, if you are the first one to move, you may make a mistake, and the second one can catch up and be ahead of you over time, like China did in traditional technology. But if technology is going to be exponential, US is number one, China is going to try to catch up, it's going to be always 1 or 2 generations behind. So the idea that China is going to take over the United States next few years turned out to be wrong. In the last few months, because of the Trump trade policies, and I'm totally against protectionism, people have started to talk about the end of American exceptionalism. But it's true that US economic growth is going to accelerate from 2 to 4, American exceptionalism is going to remain, and the outperformance of US equity markets, in spite of high valuation, is going to continue. Now, in the last few weeks, as this trade tension have escalated, I've said 2 things, 2 slogans that I'd like to try to elaborate. The first one is tech trumps tariff. The second one, tech trumps Trump too. So what do I mean by tech trumps tariff? Point number 1, it's true that many of the policies of Trump may lead to lower growth and higher inflation, protectionism, tariffs, trade wars, restriction to migration, trying to fiddle with the independence of the Fed, unfunded large fiscal deficits, less rule of law, risk of a disorderly fall of the dollar. However, already in December I said that the bad policies are going to be constrained by 4 guardrails, but 4 things going to constrain the bad policy. The first one is market discipline, the second one is Fed independence, the third one is good economic advisors, and the fourth one is his thin majority in Congress. The most important one is, of course, market discipline. When he announced those tariffs, what happened? The stock market went down, bond yields went up, credit spreads widened, the dollar started to fall in a disorderly way, and he panicked because he realized that if you continue with those policies and the tightening of financial conditions, there could be a recession, and if it was a recession, he would lose the midterm election. Now, the most important and powerful people in the world are literally the bond vigilantes. Trump controls his party, controls Congress, controls the Supreme Court, even controls social media because Twitter is owned by his buddy Elon Musk. You can control all of these things, but you cannot control the bond, the stock market, the credit, and the FX vigilantes. Used to be the case in emerging markets. You saw it in Brazil, in Argentina, in Turkey, many countries. You do something, a mistake, your sovereign spreads go to the roof, your stock market crashes, your currency goes into free fall, and you're forced to adjust macro and do reform. Then the market discipline spread to advanced economies. What happened to Greece? What happened to Italy? What happened to France? Look what happened to the UK. Liz Truss stayed in power 44 days because she did a fiscal stimulus that the market did not like. The bond yield went higher, the pound collapsed, the pension fund went into a crisis, and then she was out of power. So even the United States is a global reserve currency subject to the market discipline. The former advisor of Bill Clinton, Jim Carville, and I used to work in the Clinton administration, once said something. He said, if there is reincarnation. I want to be reborn not as the President of the United States or the Pope, allegedly the two most powerful people in the world. He said, I want to be reborn as the bond market, so I can go around and intimidate all my enemies. And that's exactly what the bond vigilantes do for you. But they constrain you from bad policy. The second constraint was, of course, the Fed. By being independent, the Fed said, if you follow policies that cause inflation, we may not cut rates. We may even raise them, and that forced Trump to back down. And some of his advisors were trade hawk, like Peter Navarro, but people like Scott Bessent wanted to de-escalate. When the market went down, they went and said to the president, I told you so. What do you want to do? You want to double down on the bad policy, or you want to blink or de-escalate? And he decided, of course, to de-escalate. And he started, of course, trade negotiation with Europe, other trading partners, and China. Trump has this natural instinct that people refer to as TALO. TALO stands for Trump always lashes out. Suddenly, wakes up in the middle of the night, has a crazy tweet, and says 50% tariff on you, 100%, 145, in the middle of the night. So Trump always lashes out. But then the market reacts, and when the market punishes you, you move to TACO. And TACO stands for Trump always chickens out. And chickens out because when the market punishes you, and you have a risk of a recession and losing the next election, you have no choice. So there are these bold swings between TALO and TACO. And when he goes into TACO, people say you chickened out, and he gets upset. And then he starts doing another tariff just to show that he's strong. But of course, he's not strong, and he has to chicken out again. And that noise, at some point, I think markets have realized they have to fade it out. You cannot react to every tweet or statement because the constraints of market discipline are going to be there. The other point important is the following one. My point about US economic growth going to 4% by the end of the decade is not just about 5 years from now. If you look at the short run, there are massive tailwinds of CapEx that is driven by investment in the technologies of the future. It's not just Mach 7, it's not just the hyperscaler, it's not just the firms in the tech sector, like the NASDAQ ones. Any firm, the S&P 500, has to have an AI strategy. Because if you don't have an AI strategy, you could be disrupted either by your competitors or by new disruptors. Take financial services. Traditional financial services have to innovate. One, because there's a challenge coming from fintech firms that are disruptors. But if you are a Bank of America or Citigroup or JP Morgan Chase, if you don't have an AI strategy, your competitor will have one, and you could be made obsolete. So everybody, even in non-tech sector, has to have that AI strategy, is investing in them. So the first quarter, when growth was negative, CapEx in the US was growing at the annual rates of 21%. And that independent of what happens with trade. Doesn't matter what tariffs are. And tech trumps tariff for the following reason. If I'm right, the increase in potential growth from 2 to 4 is 200 basis points. What's the negative impact of restriction to trade and migration? Economic estimates say at most in a likely trade and migration war, it's going to be 50 basis points. So technology is going to increase growth by 200 basis points. Tariff and migration restriction may reduce it by 50 basis points. It's a ratio between 200 to 50, 4 to 1. So tech trumps tariffs. Tech trumps tariff, but also tech trumps Trump too. And what do I mean by that? Once I gave a speech, and I made it as a joke, as a pun, but then somebody picked it up as a headline of an article about me. I said, it doesn't matter who is running the United States, who's in the White House, whether it's Trump or Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or Bernie Sanders. I said jokingly, even if Mickey Mouse was running the White House, US growth is going to be 4% at the end of this decade because the dynamism of the private sector is completely independent of the policies always have in the administration. These technologies are starting, accelerating, they're taking off, and there's no policy that's going to stop them because they have their own dynamic. And therefore, that dynamism of the US private sector is independent of the noise of trade, migration, and other types of economic policies. The other point I made was that, of course, there was for a while a game of chicken between Trump, the markets, Powell, and Xi Jinping. But the market forced Trump to blink. In the game of chicken between Trump and Powell, Trump had to blink because Powell committed not to cut rates. And attacking him was causing financial stresses in financial market. And in that game of chicken between Trump and Xi Jinping, of course, the Chinese had the upper hand because China doesn't face midterm election. China can do monetary and fiscal stimulus, while US cannot do much of it. China can weaken its currency. China can intervene and manipulate the stock market. China can punish US by restricting exports of rare earths or refined metals, can punish Apple, Tesla, and hundreds of firms that are doing FDI in China, and even has the nuclear option of dumping $1 trillion of its holdings of US Treasury, even if that would be a costly option. That's why US had to blink. However, from a medium-term perspective, China would have more economic pain as exports to the US are 2% of GDP, while US exports to China are only 0.5% of US GDP. So if that trade war had escalated, the impact on China would be more growth-wise, on the US more inflation-wise. I would say that of all the geopolitical issues of our time, the most important relationship is the one between US and China. And many of the other geopolitical conflicts are a proxy between the US and China Cold War. Because China has a number of de facto, if not de jure allies: Russia, North Korea, Iran, Pakistan, while the US has its own traditional allies. So Russia and Ukraine is in part a proxy war between US and China. Israel and Hamas, or Israel and Iran, is a proxy war between US and China. Of course, the tensions between North Korea and Japan and South Korea are a proxy again for US and China. And even the recent tensions and skirmishes between Pakistan and India are a proxy because Pakistan is a de facto ally of China, while India geopolitically is getting closer to the United States. So US-China being the key economic and geopolitical relation in the world, the most important, you have to think about what will be the scenarios. And there are three scenarios, and all three of them have a C in it. The first one will be ideal, will be full cooperation, that the US and China would cooperate on all sorts of global issues. And by the way, there are lots of global problems that require global governance: free trade, global security, climate change, health and pandemic, and so on and so on, financial stability. Unfortunately, in a world in which US and China are rival, full cooperation is not going to occur. Neither side wants to provide these global public goods with the other side free riding. And some of the complaints of the US is that China, once member of the WTO, started to free riding on the global economic trading and monetary and financial system. So unfortunately, we're not going to have full cooperation. That's ideal world is not going to happen. The other extreme, that is the most dangerous, is that US and China are on a collision course. You have confrontation, containment, and then collision. It starts with a trade war, then becomes an economic war, and eventually the Cold War gets colder and could become a hot war on the issue, for example, Taiwan. That will be a disaster, not only for US and China, but also for the world, if there was such a military conflict. Really totally disastrous for everybody. So we're not going to have full cooperation, first best. Hopefully we can avoid full collision course and containment that leads to war. So what's the middle? The middle is a world in which US and China are going to be involved in competition. This competition is going to be strategic but managed. as opposed to be unmanaged. So we may have to de-risk everything that has to do with high tech, like AI, semiconductors, and things that are essential for the national security of US and China. So on those things, there'll be full decoupling in deep tech, but that's just de-risking. But if there is then a grand bargain between US and China on all the other aspects of trade, US and China can continue to trade with each other, and every country, from those in the global south to the friends and allies of US, don't have to choose between US and China. They can do business and trade and investment and technology exchanges with US and with China. And we hope that, of course, that grand bargain is going to occur. It's not the first best world, but is one where the trade tensions get managed and they get de-escalated as opposed to being escalated. A few final observations I'll make before I conclude. In the last few months, the rhetoric has been, because of the tariffs, we're going to have a US and global recession, and a severe one. Because US is following bad policy and the US brand is damaged, American exceptionalism is over. And because American exceptionalism is over and US is running large twin current account fiscal deficit and is scaring foreign investor, the exorbitant privilege of the US dollar is also ending. And you'll have a demise of the US dollar as a global reserve currency. Point number one, I pointed out that if there's going to be de-escalation, there'll be some increase in inflation. US economic growth is going to stall to less than 1%, maybe close to zero by the end of the year. But if you de-escalate, probably we avoid a recession. Or even if we had a recession, maybe you have a couple of quarters of negative economic growth, close to zero and epsilon negative, Q4 and Q1. But then the Fed is going to cut rates because the economy goes in a recession and inflation expectations are anchored, and then the economy is going to recover in the second half of next year. So at worst, you get a short and shallow recession, or at best, you avoid one. So the risk of a global recession, if market discipline forces you to de-escalate and chicken out, are lower than the panic that Wall Street had in April by saying our baseline is a US and global recession. I said no. Market discipline is going to force to de-escalate, to blink, and we're going to avoid it. Second point, tech trumps tariffs, and therefore American exceptionalism not only is not over, but US potential growth is going to increase. And therefore returns to US market are going to remain high, and US is going to remain a destination for positive investment, and China is not going to take over the world or become the largest economy. Chinese growth is decelerating for a number of structural factors like aging, deleveraging, housing bust, state capitalism, restriction to technology, inability to dump their excess capacity in global market, and so on and so on. So in the race between US and China, US is going to remain the preeminent economic power in the world. China is going to do well. I'm not talking about a hard landing, but a second. And US growth might be even higher than China. And final point, on the dollar and exorbitant privilege, is US that it's true that some investors who are holding bonds worry about current US fiscal deficits. They may sell bonds, they might sell dollars, and that may weaken the dollar while rising bond yields. But if I'm right about American exceptionalism, there'll be a boom in investment in US. That capex boom implies that actually the US current account deficit is going to remain large in spite of tariff. Why large? Because the current account is saving minus investment. If investment goes higher compared to national savings, you're importing capital from the rest of the world to finance the excess of investment over a saving. So the US current account deficit is not going to go lower, but that doesn't imply a weakening of the dollar or a collapse of the value of the dollar as a global reserve currency, because there'll be massive flows of capital that are equity capital rather than debt capital to finance this investment boom in the United States. So the dollar might weaken, but gradually, and inflows of equity capital are going to prevent a disorderly collapse of the dollar and the US dollar losing its global reserve currency status. Now, in every century, the global reserve currency is the currency of the leading economic and financial and trading and military power of the times, right? It went from the Netherlands to France to Spain, the United Kingdom, and now the United States. Now, Trump has done a lot to damage the brand of the United States, and many people are upset with his really dumb policies on trade, on migration, regarding the Fed, regarding rule of law, students, and you name it. However, I made the argument it doesn't matter who's in power, and American exceptions will remain, and therefore the global reserve currency role of the dollar is not going to disappear. People may not like the dollar, but you cannot replace something with nothing. And when people say we don't like the dollar, what is the alternative? Now, my former advisor, and I worked for him when he was Secretary of the Treasury, Larry Summers, once made a joke. He said, people don't like the dollar, but Europe is a museum, China is a prison, Japan is a nursing home, and Bitcoin is just a failing experiment. So, and certainly it's never going to become a global reserve currency, regardless of its value. So people may not like the dollar, but what's the alternative to the dollar? The RMB, highly unlikely given all these kind of trends. So we live in a world that is very different from the previous world. It's going to be maybe more fragmented. There are geopolitical risks, there are economic risks, there's too much debt, private and public, there are stagflationary forces. But it's also a world in which technology is going to increase productivity growth. Those who innovate are going to do better than those who do not innovate. But also those who adapt this technology are going to do well. And even if you don't innovate, in a world where US grows at 4%, China grows at 4%, is a pretty good world in which even the global south and countries like Brazil, others in Latin America, who are producing for the Chinese markets, and also places like Brazil where energy is cheap and data centers could be based here much cheaper than in US and Europe, other parts of the world, you can benefit from the leverage that comes from the technology of the future because you can do business with US, with China, there'll be a competition between them on who's going to be controlling many of the natural resources like the rare metals, the green metals, and others that are produced in the global south. And you can adopt this technology and become more competitive. And Brazil is an example where you have a very sophisticated financial sector with lots of innovation. If you adopt those technologies, you can be at the technological frontier, even if you're not the one that's doing the most, deep tech innovation in them. So there's lots of stuff can go wrong in the world. It's a world of geopolitical depression, of mega threats, but also a world in which if we use technology in a good way, we can continue the relative period of 80 years of peace, progress, and prosperity that we've had since World War II. That period may not end, was bumpy for many reasons, but maybe with a secular boom driven by using technology in the right way can lead us to a better future where income is higher, welfare is higher, and peace and prosperity remain with us for the long term. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. Yeah.
I would like to thank for Mrs. Roubini for your presence and all the important content that he brought to us tonight. Bom, a gente vai completar ainda mais esse nosso conteúdo. Então, enquanto a gente está aqui organizando rapidamente o nosso palco, em poucos segundos eu já vou anunciar os jornalistas que vão conduzir aqui um rápido bate-papo para complementar todas as informações que ele trouxe aqui para a gente. Então, gostaria, então, de anunciar a presença aqui no palco dos jornalistas Célia Frouf, ela que é repórter especial de economia da Broadcast em Brasília. Vem para cá, Célia, seja muito bem-vinda. Convido também Fernando Nakagawa, ele que é âncora do CNN Money também com a gente. Seja muito bem-vindo. Microfones abertos, Célia. Passo a bola para você já.
Alô, alô. Good evening. We just heard your words And now I think we know why you were the Dr. Doom 20 years ago, and now, and now you are known Dr. Boom. Are you really optimistic with the words you mentioned, the new technologies, the strengths of the dollar?
You hear me still, right? Yeah, this one. Yeah, I mean, usually I say, neither doom or doom or gloom. You have to be realist. We live in a world in which there are downside risk and upside risk. There are threats, but there are also opportunity. And you have to be realistic about the kind of things can go wrong. And I wrote a whole book about them. But even in that book, there were 2 chapters, one AI and one about the utopian future, where I pointed out that things can go much better if this technological innovation occurs and are adopted in the right way. Because, by the way, technological innovation may also have side effects like misinformation, disinformation, deepfake, political manipulation, the risk of permanent technological unemployment, the risk of even some people say making the human race obsolete or building more geopolitical tension. Technology by itself is neutral. Whether it's good or bad depends on how we use it. So you have to make all those caveats. But I would say that in the last 3 years, we've seen Gen AI, we've seen quantum, we've seen humanoid robots, we've seen fusion, seen space exploration, exploitation. Lots of things are happening, like AlphaFold, and developments in biology make me think that the positives are starting to accelerate. And if they accelerate, we can manage better the downsides. But in many parts of the world, governance is poor, macroeconomic policies are poor, there's lots of high debt, there's inflation, there is a dysfunctional political system, there's still real hot wars from Russia, Ukraine, to Israel and Hamas, to what's happening between India and Pakistan. So lots of things can go wrong, and I'm fully aware of them, and I write about them, but I'm saying what can go right as well.
Professor, on Brazil, what's your view about your country? Because nowadays the market here are definitely pessimist on the future. Are you optimist, pessimist on Brazil?
Well, on Brazil, I would say the situation, it's a mixed bag. On one side, economic growth looks like fine, and you had many quarters of consecutive positive economic growth. Real income and real wages are growing. Unemployment rate, at least if you don't include the partially unemployed people, is relatively low. And you have still a significant amount of dynamic from exports by exporting all the variety of commodities you do to China and the rest of the world. There's lots of innovation actually in ag business, and you name it. So things are going well, and it's a stable democracy. No democracy is perfect, but this is a solid democracy with free press, free institution. Even threat to this democracy were pushed away. The challenges are perfectly known to everybody here. While monetary policy is a central bank that is independent, fiscal policy is still too loose, deficit and debts are too high, there are rules about fiscal consolidation, but achieving those fiscal consolidation is hard. And in order to increase potential growth, macro stability, monetary and fiscal, is only necessary, but not sufficient condition to do the kind of reform that increase essentially potential growth, reducing red tape, reducing bureaucracy, reducing corruption, all the other restrictions to private sector, business activity, and so on. And those things are occurring more slowly than otherwise. You'll have democratic elections next year. We don't know yet who are going to be the candidate on the right and the left. And depending on those results of the elections, you could have a beginning of more fiscal consolidation and more reforms, or more of the same. The risk of more of the same is that, when you maintain the status quo, eventually things become bad, because with large deficits, the debt to GDP ratio rises, then bond yields are higher, there is overheating, there is inflation, the central bank has to keep interest rates higher and for longer, and then that creates lots of other problems of cost of borrowing for the government, for the private sector, and so on. So I would say whoever is in power here cannot be complacent, because on one side, the country is stable compared to other emerging markets that are much more in trouble, but stability is not sufficient. You have to improve, because staying where you are in a world with lots of other noise and shock and domestic threats is a world that becomes more fragile for you over time.
You've just talked about emerging markets. I'd like to hear from you, especially BRICS ones. What do you think about this group?
You know, I always found that the label of BRICS was a little bit stretched. You know, when Jim O'Neill wrote those pieces, people said they're going to grow much faster than US, Europe, and advanced economy, and most of the world is going to be growth driven by the BRICS. But among those BRICS, you know, China used to grow 10%, then before COVID 7, after COVID 5, and given the headwinds, growth in China could fall to 3-4% by the end of this decade. You know, South Africa has its own problems of governance, potential growth barely 2%. In Russia, even before the war, potential growth was barely 1.5%, and with the sanctions over the medium term, it's closer to 0. And you know, Brazil has always been the country of the future where potential is 2-3. This is okay for a country at this level of middle income, and with this poverty, you have to grow 4-5% to really reduce some of those inequalities and increase the jobs and income and whatever not. So the only bright shining light so far is India is growing 6-7%, and maybe more if they do more reform. So it's not true that the BRICS are these high growth countries. And also, you know, the G7 is a club of advanced economies. They have similar economies, similar political system, similar geopolitical stance, friends and allies of the West. While of the initial 5 BRICS, let alone the bigger number today, some are autocracies like China and Russia, some are democracies like India, Brazil, and South Africa. Some of them are rivals of the West, China and Russia. Some of them are these global South swing states that are in the middle, like Brazil and South Africa. Some of them, like India, being a rival of the China, that are getting close to the United States and the West. Economically, some like China are manufacturing powerhouse, India, IT and services, Russia, Brazil, and South Africa more in commodities, and so on and so on. So they're very, very different. So the idea that you're going to have a common economic policy, common views, common currency, or common geopolitical views when you have this rivalry within US and India, so between China and India, I think it's far-fetched. So it's nice they get together, they talk about stuff, but I don't see the BRICS as being a real unified group of countries that have same views about most of the issues of the world. We can then, how to say, debate them with the G7 in a way that makes things very, very different.
Professor, in terms of financial assets, looking for sectors, geography, in Brazil or in emerging markets, what looks for you a good bet, a good position for the future from now? I mean, something like energy transition or even oil sector. What looks better for you?
Well, before there is a sectoral stuff, of course, of the 30-plus emerging markets, some of them have better economic fundamentals with macro stability and good reform. Some of them are a train wreck. Some of them used to be a train wreck, but now they're doing a lot of fiscal and monetary and structural adjustment, like Argentina, finally going in the right direction. Even within Latin America, you cannot lump all these things together. You know, I would say, you know, the green transition is going to occur, but in that transition, we're going to still need a lot of fossil fuels, and probably as a transition, we're going to need lots of natural gas if we want to phase out oil gradually and coal.
So those are the kind of things you have to think about. I would say that as long as China grows 4 or 5%, the demand for variety of commodity, whether it's food and ag, industrial metals, green metals, and other things, is going to continue. So there's a lot of demand. The question is how much you can increase supply. Maybe supply increases slower than demand, and therefore high prices are going to stay with us. But let's say every country is emerging market, especially Latin America. They have to try to diversify away from just resources and finding their own ways of developing domestic markets and global markets. And Brazil happens to be a very large country, 120 million people. And as much as you can, you have to invest into infrastructures, you have to invest into human capital and the skills and education of the labor force. You have to invest into social capital that comes with good governance and rule of law. And then, other good things are going to be happening as well. But, I wouldn't say pick this sector as opposed to another one in particular.
May I have the next one? Professor, when you look for the technology, what is the impact in terms of pricing? I mean, is a deflationary effect or inflationary effect? And looking for the work market, for the jobs, are you concerned with technology and the possibility to cancel thousands and thousands of jobs?
Technological innovations are like a positive aggregate supply shock that increases production but reduces the cost of production. So it's disinflationary or deflationary, but it's not bad deflation driven by debt crisis and the need to deleverage with low demand, that is low growth and low inflation. That's bad deflation, like after the GFC, right during COVID or during the Great Depression. But it's good deflation. That implies we produce cheaper and therefore purchasing power is rising. So, and that's why, while in the short run, inflationary and stagflationary forces are stronger, if I'm right about this technological secular boom, over time we'll have more growth and lower inflation over time. The second part was on
the job.
That's a big dilemma, because there's the debate among economists on whether technology is complementary with workers, so you'll have more jobs and maybe more jobs of the future, or if eventually is substitute for jobs and eventually get permanent technological unemployment. I believe in the short run actually need more workers to do all this stuff, but eventually, gradually, over time, you can have permanent technological unemployment. But I would say the following thing. I mean, suppose you are in a world in which growth goes from 2 to 4 to 6, and unemployment rate goes to 5 to 10 to 20 to 30. It's better to be in a world in which you are growing 6%, and then you can tax the winners and redistribute to everybody else and make everybody better off, even if some people have permanent technological employment, than being in a world in which you're growing 1% and you have today low unemployment, but it's going to be disrupted by technology in the future. So if you have 4% growth, then 6, then 8, whatever, you can resolve many problems, problems of debt and also problem of jobs. And of course, you'll have to do some variant of universal basic income. You have to tax the machines, or those who own the capital own the machine. You have to tax the top 10% distribution of skills, education, human capital. Like I'm sure everybody here, we're going to be benefiting from using AI technology to make them more productive, but then if everybody else, low value added or medium value added, blue collar, white collar, get displaced, then we have to tax the winners and redistribute to those who are left behind. Otherwise, we're going to have social strife over time. But it's a good problem to have high growth and then having to redistribute, as opposed to having, low growth when everybody is equal but poor.
Okay, Professor, you just have to say thank you for your words, for staying with us this night. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
muitíssimo obrigada, Célia, muitíssimo obrigada também ao Fernando, novamente, ao Roubini, pela presença e também por esse conteúdo exclusivo que eles trouxeram aqui pra gente essa noite. Por favor, gente, podem ficar à vontade, se vocês precisarem tirar aqui as cadeiras, porque a gente vai seguindo adiante com a nossa premiação, porque ainda tem mais, gente, muito mais, inclusive. Bora lá então, gente, olha só, essa é a hora de anunciar os analistas de investimentos que mais acertaram nas recomendações no ano de 2024. São profissionais de corretoras e de bancos que cobrem o mercado de ações brasileiro. Então, dentro de instantes, vocês vão conhecer aqui os analistas de mercado que apresentaram as recomendações com o retorno mais elevado para os investidores em bolsa de valores. Cada analista participa com uma carteira que é formada por todas as ações que ele ou ela cobrem ao longo do ano. E também será revelada aqui a corretora vencedora pelo ano de 2024. Olha, o ranking é elaborado anualmente pela Broadcast com base em uma metodologia desenvolvida pelo INSPER e com informações coletadas pela área de dados da Broadcast. Como na dinâmica anterior, eu reforço aqui que eu vou anunciar todos os premiados, somente os 3 primeiros colocados deverão subir aqui ao palco para receber os troféus, isso por conta do nosso tempo. Então, do 10º ao 4º lugar, vocês vão receber os seus troféus no momento do coquetel. Vamos lá, então? Bem, os vencedores do Prêmio Broadcast Analistas 2025 são... O 10º lugar do Prêmio Broadcast Analistas 2025 vai para Rafael Dias, analista de Equity Research dos setores elétricos e de saneamento no BB Investimentos. No 9º lugar do Prêmio Broadcast Analistas, temos Pedro Fontana, Equity Research Associate no Bradesco BBI. Já na 8ª posição do ranking, temos os analistas do Itaú BBA, Bruno Tomazetto, Equity Research Associate, Agribusiness, Food and Beverage. Também Gustavo Troiano, analista de agronegócio e alimentos e bebidas. Partindo para a 7ª colocação do Prêmio Broadcast Analistas, temos a equipe do Santander, e são eles: Guilherme Pedroni Palhares, Head de Alimentos, Bebidas e Agronegócio, e a Laura Irata, analista de Alimentos, Bebidas e Agronegócio. Partindo para a 6ª colocação do prêmio, eu anuncio uma analista, e é ela, Georgia Jorge, analista de Equity Research dos setores agronegócios, alimentos e bebidas no BB Investimentos. Já na 5ª colocação do prêmio, também temos uma analista, e é a Fernanda Urbano, Equity Research Analyst Capital Goods, na XP Investimentos. A 4ª colocação também vai para uma equipe do Santander, são eles: Anaí Rios, Associate Especialista, e o Ricardo Navarro, Managing Director, Head Latam Banks. Muito bom! E agora, para prestigiar a 3ª colocação do Prêmio Broadcast Analistas, eu convido ao nosso palco para a entrega do troféu o Carlos Augusto Lopes, ele que é CEO da Ucbar, que é mais uma empresa patrocinadora do nosso evento. Seja muito bem-vindo, tudo bem? Muito bem, troféu apostos aqui, eu anuncio então o 3º lugar do Prêmio Broadcast Analistas, que vai para Vladimir Pinto, Head de Utilities na XP Investimentos. Vem para cá, Vladimir, receber seu troféu, parabéns! Tudo bom? Parabéns. Por favor. Pode fazer a Vladimir, à vontade para fazer seu agradecimento.
Ok. Bom, primeiro agradecer a Broadcast por ter dado pelo prêmio, né? No passado eu tive a oportunidade de estar aqui. E, obviamente, agradecer a minha equipe, o Bruno e a Manuela, que trabalharam comigo. Então, eles também me ajudaram bastante. E a todos que estão aqui, boa noite, muito obrigado.
Parabéns. Muito obrigada, Vladimir. Obrigada também ao Carlos pela entrega. E a gente segue, então, com o troféu do segundo colocado do nosso Prêmio Analistas. E eu convido agora ao palco mais um representante dos nossos patrocinadores. É o CEO da Opus. Seja muito bem-vindo, Francisco Elias Barguil. É isso aí, surpresa aqui, ó. São dois? É isso aí, são dois. Então, o segundo lugar do Prêmio Broadcast Analistas vai para a equipe do Santander, composta pelo André Sampaio, Head of Latam Utilities, e o Guilherme Ferreira Lima, analista de Utilities. Venham para cá, André e Guilherme, troféu esperando por vocês. Vamos fazer a foto de vocês aqui no centro. Parabéns, André. Parabéns, Guilherme. Vou pedir aqui para um de vocês fazer, então, esse agradecimento pela equipe. À vontade.
Pessoal, muito obrigado pela participação de todos aqui no evento. Acho que a gente queria agradecer, obviamente, o Broadcast e a todos os presentes aqui. É um prazer aqui representar o time aqui de Utilities do Santander, o Guilherme aqui do meu time. O João, infelizmente, não conseguiu estar com a gente. Mas, mais uma vez, obrigado. É uma honra aqui receber o prêmio mais uma vez no Broadcast. Obrigado.
Muito bom. Obrigada a todos vocês. Sempre muito bom ganhar prêmio, né, gente? Parabéns. É isso aí. Então, agora, para a entrega do troféu ao primeiro colocado, eu convido o diretor executivo de produtos da Broadcast. Vem para cá, Rodrigo Galazzini. Bem-vindo. Agora são 3. Troféu chegando antes, já entrega, né? Equilibrar aí os prêmios. Tá premiado. Olha só, gente. Então, o primeiro lugar do Prêmio Broadcast Analistas 2025 vai para a equipe do Itaú BB, composta pelo Felipe Andrade, vice-presidente, Luísa Candiota, associate, e o Vitor Cunha, Equity Research Associate Utilities, e também Marcelo Sá, ex-Itaú BBA. Ele não pôde estar aqui com a gente hoje, também é premiado. Não dá para a gente trazer 4 troféus aqui, é muito troféu para pouca mão. A gente aguarda vocês aqui no palco, por favor. Fazer a foto de vocês todos juntos. Parabéns pela equipe do Itaú. Parabéns para a equipe do Itaú, também ao Marcelo Sá. Vou abrir o microfone aqui para um de vocês fazer esse breve agradecimento. À vontade.
Primeiramente, boa noite.
Boa noite.
Só reiterar aqui o agradecimento para a Agência Broadcast, o agradecimento ao time e, enfim, parabenizar aí pelos anos aí de entrega e de ajuda bastante, porque o nosso trabalho de analista seu site.
Parabéns para vocês pelo trabalho, sucesso, que venham os próximos prêmios, gente. Obrigada a todos, obrigada também, Rodrigo, pela participação. E agora, para a entrega do troféu da Corretora do Ano de 2025, eu convido ao palco o diretor de Vendas e Marketing, Bruno Scheibe. Vem para cá, Bruno. Bem-vindo. É isso aí, troféu na mão. E a vencedora na categoria Corretora do Ano vai para Santander Corretora. Convido os profissionais da Santander Corretora: André Sampaio, Head de Utilities, Guilherme Palhares, Head de Alimentos, Bebidas e Agronegócios. Venham para cá receber o troféu em nome da corretora, por favor. Dobradinha, mais um troféu. Diga lá.
Boa noite a todos. Queria agradecer primeiro o Broadcast pela organização do evento e por valorizar tanto o nosso trabalho como analistas. Muito feliz de representar o Santander aqui. A gente tem um trabalho todo por trás do que a gente vê no relatório que sai no final, seja o nosso time de vendas mostrando o nosso produto, trazendo o tato do mercado, trazendo insight, até os analistas fazendo uma análise fundamental e trazendo um produto de alto valor. Então, queria agradecer o time, queria agradecer em especial também os júniores que estão aqui com a gente hoje, que tocam muito, não só os seniors ficam muito na relação comercial, mas que fazem muitas análises. Aqui, Anaí, hoje representada, Laura do meu time, o Guilherme do time do André também. É muito importante a gente ver esses analistas crescendo e se desenvolvendo. Então, em nome do Santander, queria agradecer. Muito obrigado, uma boa noite a todos.
É isso aí, já são os júniores que estão aqui recebendo os troféus, É isso aí, parabéns para vocês mais uma vez. Obrigada, André, obrigada, Guilherme. Parabéns a Santander Corretora pelo prêmio, assim como parabéns a todos os analistas desse ranking. Obrigada, Bruno, também pela sua participação aqui na entrega do troféu. Gente, lembrando que os vencedores da 4ª colocação devem retirar os troféus com a nossa equipe, logo mais no momento do coquetel, e assim vocês vão poder fazer também as fotos de vocês no nosso super backdrop, que está lindão ali atrás, aguardando por todos vocês com os seus troféus. E as premiações ainda não acabaram, gente. Nós vamos à entrega da 25ª edição do Prêmio Broadcast Empresas, que é a última premiação dessa noite. Esse ranking, cuja metodologia é da Broadcast, conta com a parceria da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, a FGV, para trazer até vocês as empresas listadas em bolsa que apresentam os melhores resultados para os investidores. O resultado do ranking é uma combinação dos indicadores técnicos mais utilizados pelo mercado e tem como base o ano passado, 2024. Em parceria com a FGV, foram avaliadas mais de 200 companhias brasileiras de capital aberto, conforme 7 indicadores bastante conhecidos por analistas financeiros, como retorno sobre patrimônio, liquidez, dividendos, entre outros. Os cálculos são realizados pela Broadcast e validados pela FGV. Então, é chegada a hora de conhecer as 10 empresas mais bem colocadas na 25ª edição do Prêmio Broadcast Empresas. Para esse prêmio, eu vou anunciar os 10 premiados. Os 5 primeiros colocados vão subir aqui ao palco para receber os troféus. Os demais premiados, do 10º ao 6º lugar, vão receber os troféus no momento do coquetel, como eu mencionei aqui anteriormente. Combinado? Então vamos lá, gente. O 10º lugar do Prêmio Broadcast Empresas vai para Curi. É isso aí. O 9º lugar do Prêmio Broadcast Empresas é da Ambev. O 8º lugar foi garantido pela Wilson Sons. Temos o 7º lugar do Broadcast Empresas, que é de Caixa Seguridade. E o 6º colocado, quem será? BRF. Muito bem, para a entrega do troféu ao 5º colocado, eu convido dessa vez ao palco Fernando Mirandês, ele que é da Pinheiro Neto Advogados, mais uma empresa patrocinadora do nosso evento. Seja muito bem-vindo. Então vamos lá, eu anuncio agora o 5º lugar do Prêmio Broadcast Empresas, que vai para JBS. Eu convido o diretor de comunicação da JBS, o Juliano Nóbrega, para receber aqui o troféu e fazer o seu agradecimento. Seja bem-vindo. Fica à vontade para o seu agradecimento.
Vou agradecer Broadcast, todo o time. A celebração hoje aqui não é só das empresas, mas também do jornalismo econômico, né, que é tão importante para o funcionamento dos mercados, importante para os investidores, né? E chega num momento muito especial para a empresa, que está concretizando agora a sua dupla listagem, né? A partir do final, até o final do mês teremos listados nos Estados Unidos também, sem perder a nossa essência, né? Uma empresa que nasceu há mais de 70 anos, um pequeno açougue no interior de Goiás, e hoje tem fábricas em 18 países, vende seus produtos para mais de 180 países, e está lá na nossa missão, além de sermos os melhores naquilo que nos propusemos a fazer, rentabilidade ao acionista, que é o que está sendo premiado aqui. Então, mais uma vez, agradecer ao Broadcast, a todo o time aí. Muito obrigado. Em nome dos 280 mil colaboradores da JBS, esse prêmio é deles também. Obrigado.
Parabéns, muito obrigada. Fernando, obrigada, Juliano, também, pela participação. E agora, para a entrega do troféu ao quarto colocado, eu convido ao palco Ivana Mozetic, diretora de marketing da Rimini Street, um dos nossos patrocinadores. Seja muito bem-vinda. Vamos lá, então, ao quarto lugar do Prêmio Broadcast Empresas, que foi conquistado por Klabin. Convido ao palco a diretora de Finanças Corporativas e de Relações com Investidores, Gabriela Vogue. Seja muito bem-vinda, Gabriela. Parabéns. Parabéns a Klabin pela quarta colocação. O microfone para você, Gabriela.
Muito obrigada ao Broadcast. Uma verdadeira honra representar a Klabin num evento tão seleto com empresas, analistas, corretoras, ou seja, o que tem de melhor no mercado financeiro aqui hoje. Agradeço muito no nome de todo o time Klabin. Muito obrigada.
A gente que agradece, parabeniza a Gabriela, todo o time Klabin. Muito obrigada. E agora, para prestigiar a terceira colocação do Prêmio Broadcast Empresas, eu convido ao palco para a entrega deste troféu o professor da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, nosso parceiro no ranking. Vem para cá, professor Emerson Fernandes Marçal. Bem-vindo. Muito bom, então vamos lá, professor, porque o terceiro lugar do Prêmio Broadcast Empresas vai para BB Seguros. E eu convido a Priscila Lorenzini Palma Reis, superintendente de gestão das participações da BB Seguros. Vem para cá receber este troféu. Lá está ela.
Obrigada, Broadcast. Em nome da BB Seguros, eu transmito esse reconhecimento aos cerca de 200 colaboradores da nossa holding, que, junto com as equipes das nossas empresas investidas, impulsionam com muita dedicação e excelência os resultados dessa companhia bilionária. Também a gente precisa reconhecer os nossos clientes, que estão no centro das nossas decisões, e os nossos acionistas, que acreditam no nosso potencial de entrega de resultados e de transformar desafios em oportunidades. Esse prêmio materializa a nossa capacidade de entregar esses resultados e de avançar, seguir inovando e entregar cada vez mais resultados consistentes. Muito obrigada.
Muito bom. Obrigada a você, Priscila. Parabéns mais uma vez. Obrigada, professor Emerson, também. E agora, para a entrega da segunda colocação do Prêmio Broadcast Empresas, convido ao palco o diretor de redação da Broadcast, Márcio Rodrigues. Vem para cá, bem-vindo, Márcio. Simbora, tudo bem? Vamos lá, gente. O segundo lugar do Prêmio Broadcast Empresas vai para VEG. Eu convido o CFO da VEG, André Luiz Rodrigues. Vem para cá receber a homenagem no nosso palco. Seja muito bem-vindo.
noite a todos. É uma grande satisfação, em nome da VEG, receber esse reconhecimento. Gostaria de agradecer e parabenizar o Broadcast, as empresas aqui presentes. É uma satisfação fazer parte de um grupo seleto de profissionais e empresas. 2024 foi um ano de muitas conquistas para a VEG. Nós expandimos a nossa posição em mercados estratégicos, aceleramos investimentos em inovação e transição energética, tudo isso para atender as necessidades dos nossos clientes. E esse reconhecimento simboliza toda a confiança dos nossos stakeholders e a dedicação dos mais de 41 mil colaboradores da VEG no Brasil e no exterior. Muito obrigado.
Sucesso, muito obrigada. Parabéns, André, parabéns à VEG, obrigada, Márcio, pela participação. E agora, para a entrega do primeiro colocado, eu convido o CEO da Broadcast. Vem para cá mais uma vez, Denis Piovesan, por favor, bem-vindo. Três. 4. Vamos fazer malabarismo aqui, ó. Segura firme, por favor. Muito bem, então a empresa vencedora do primeiro lugar do Prêmio Broadcast Empresas 2025 e ainda das 3 categorias especiais Small Cap, Novo Mercado e Sustentabilidade vai para Santos Brasil. Eu tenho a honra de convidar o CFO, diretor econômico financeiro e de relações com investidores da Santos Brasil. Vem para cá, Daniel Pedreira Dória. Tem muito troféu aqui para você, hein? Fazer uma força-tarefa aqui para te ajudar. Vamos juntos aqui segurar o microfone, segurar o troféu para você poder fazer o seu agradecimento.
Boa noite, tudo bem? Agora ficou complicado aqui, eu não esperava por isso, mas
bom, né?
É uma honra aqui de presente de tantas empresas peso pesados listadas na B3, assim, realmente honrado, agradeço o Broadcast, 3.800 funcionários que eu represento aqui. E 2024, de fato, foi um ano muito especial para a empresa. Batemos recorde do top ao bottom line. Eu acho que a premiação simboliza esse bom trabalho, alguma coisa está sendo bem feita, ainda bem. E deixar aqui todo esse agradecimento. A Santos Brasil não perde 3 pilares. A gente inova, a gente investe pesado em infraestrutura e logística no Brasil e não perdemos de vista a alta criação de valor aos nossos acionistas. E com isso, fecho aqui esse agradecimento. Muito obrigado. Não sei como eu vou carregar aqui, alguém me ajuda.
A gente ajuda. Muitíssimo obrigada. Parabéns, Denis. Parabéns, equipe. Parabéns também a todas as empresas premiadas que tiveram os melhores resultados para os seus acionistas. Eu reforço mais uma vez que os troféus estão disponíveis com a nossa equipe. Poderão e deverão ser retirados assim que nós encerrarmos a nossa cerimônia. Foi um enorme prazer tê-los aqui com a gente em mais um evento de premiação. Também a todos que nos acompanharam aqui online. Em nome da Broadcast, Agência Estado, eu agradeço a todos vocês que participaram do nosso evento, assim como agradeço também aos nossos patrocinadores. São eles, Boyden, Equinix, Fênix Market Data, Hiperflow, Nasdaq, Opus, Pinheiro Neto Advogados, Rimini Street e Uquibar. Nosso agradecimento também à Fundação Getúlio Vargas pela parceria na validação do ranking Empresas e, claro, o apoio de CNN Money e Estadão. Convido a todos vocês agora para o coquetel que vai ser servido a seguir. Aproveitem. E aos que utilizaram fones para tradução, peço, por favor, que devolvam os equipamentos para as recepcionistas. Um grande abraço, uma ótima noite e até a próxima. Tchau.
Let's start in style, let's dance for a while. Heaven can wait, we're only watching the skies, hoping for the best.